I want to talk to you guys about a bombshell that is being reported exclusively by Reuters. Multiple anonymous government officials that are coming forward from the Iranian government and telling Reuters that the Iranians told the Russians in advance of the big Moscow Crocus terror attack that happened, killed 144 people, injured many others, burnt down the concert hall, was a massive tragedy. But since then, the Russians have been trying to find, at least this is what it looks like from an outside observer's POV, have been trying to find some way to finger the Ukrainians in this. Now, the Americans warned the Russians in advance, a few weeks advance, that there was a threat of a terror attack in Moscow and specifically at concert halls. Now, the Russians dismissed this threat 3 days beforehand. Putin said it was an attempt to destabilize Russia. 3 days later, terror attack happens, and then the evidence starts to come out, and it seems to clearly indicate that it was ISIS. It was done in a style with these guys looking like complete amateurs, at least to me, where they were trying to throw the bullets out them. You don't see, if somebody's doing this with a gun, they're like trying to throw the bullet at somebody. They don't know what they're doing. That's not a trained soldier. That's not some CIA operative. That's somebody that's been given a gun and has been either pumped full of some ideology to go attack or been gotten and told to go attack. So they were fighting like ISIS does. The attack looked like an ISIS attack would usually look like. ISIS claimed the attack. They released footage, GoPro footage from the attackers, and released pictures from what they said, even though they were wearing balaclavas and stuff, that they said were the attackers that did the attack. And the people who were involved, and I don't want to be and the last thing I want to do is perpetuate stereotypes, but these were Tajiks, and ISIS-K, and I hate using that abbreviation, but that's what everyone calls it, has used Tajik fighters in the past. So these are also people coming from a country that this has happened in before. Not saying that they have to be Tajik for it to have happened. ISIS has been able to recruit people from many different parts of the globe, Belgium, France, America. So that's not a strict constraint, but it is something that I think should at the very least be noted. And so all the evidence seemed to be pointing in one way, and that is ISIS did it. It looked like an ISIS attack. It was claimed by ISIS. It was claimed by the Amaq News Agency, which is ISIS's news agency. It followed a pattern of behavior from ISIS. The intelligence seemed to point that way. ISIS had motivation to do this since they're against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and that is backed by Russia. Russia is fighting ISIS in many parts throughout Africa. ISIS has been an opponent of the Russians before. And so I think that this is an example early on, at least from my perspective, as the Russians were coming out and finding some way to finger the Ukrainians. At first saying, hey, I saw pictures immediately posted. This van outside, that's actually a Ukrainian van. I looked at the license plates. They were Belarusian plates. Okay, so that maybe it wasn't a Ukrainian van. But the people who were evacuating were going back to Ukraine. That's what the Russian government claimed. Now, they haven't been able to substantiate this, and then there were people from Belarus, like Lukashenko, that came forward that actually maybe they were coming to Belarus, that seemed to counter that idea, which Putin disagreed with that assertion from the Belarusians. But they haven't been able to provide any evidence of that. And then they said, well, actually, cryptocurrency, the cryptocurrency did it. The Ukrainians paid ISIS to do the operation. Now, they could show the cryptocurrency transactions if they had a record of it. They could show the crypto wallet. They could go in there and do that. They haven't. I remember when David Sachs was coming out and beating his chest, very proud of himself that he thought it was the Ukrainians that did it. He was calling for them to show that, which is leading me to believe that, you know, he really buys his own nonsense. But they have been unable to provide that. So all the evidence seemed to be pointing in one direction. If it looks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. But then the Russians kept pushing it, that it was the Ukrainians. It was the Ukrainians. You saw them start signing shells. You saw people coming out, I think it was Shaman, came out with a song telling people to mobilize. You saw Russian state TV beating the drums, blaming Ukraine, pointing at Ukraine. If you looked at Russian printed press, that means Russian state newspapers, you would see these covers with all these different Western leaders in this burning effigy that was supposed to represent Crocus, saying that Olaf Scholz did it, that Biden did it, that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, did it, that all these different Western leaders did the attack, even though yet they have provided no evidence. And I knew it got bad once they got George Galloway and Scott Ritter on the beat to start arguing into why it was the Ukrainians. With no evidence, of course. But once you've got those people beating the drum for you, you know it's a lie. Because those people only open their mouths to lie. If they're breathing, they are lying. The problem for the Russians is, though, if this would have stopped here, it already would have been bad enough because no one believes them. But now it's even worse because it's worse on two fronts. Number one, it's going to be worse on the front that I think further buttresses the idea that it was probably ISIS. And number two, it's bad because it just shows that this really was a security failure of the Russian state. So the Iranians did warn them, and we have a caption here from the article that explains what happened. Days before the attack in Russia, Tehran shared information with Moscow about a possible big terrorist attack inside Russia that was acquired during interrogations of those arrested in connection with deadly bombings in Iran. So the Iranians captured terrorists in Iran who were doing bombings, and then they were able to get information about a possible terror attack in Russia. Now, for those of you who are wondering about how the United States got its intel about a possible terror attack, it apparently had to do with communications, with us hearing their chatter, intercepting their communications. That's how we found it, whereas the Iranians found it through a different intelligence route, through interrogation. Now, if you're the Russians, and if you're being told by the Americans at first, hey, look, we intercepted communications. We think there's going to be a terror attack. Okay, ignore that. It's already bad that you ignore that. Nation states have a duty to inform in these situations, and America was fulfilling its duty by informing the Russians, just like the Iranians were fulfilling their duty by informing the Russians. They could try to ignore it and say, this is, maybe just be extra conspiratorial or like just distrustful of us due to the geopolitics of the situation and say, screw it. No, I don't believe you. They could do that. But the Iranians, what motivations do the Iranians have? The Shahed drones that I've, had blow up in the backyard of village homes I'm staying in Ukraine as they get intercepted. Horrible, terrible weapons that screech through the skies. All Ukrainians now know the sound that sounds like a lawnmower going through the house or ramming into apartment blocks. It's horrific. It was the Iranians that provided them with the original Shahed drones and then allowed the Russians to produce them. The Iranians took artillery shells and sent it over to the Russians. The Iranians have been working very closely with the Russians. Why would the Iranians, of all people, start backing up American intelligence operations to back up or try to increase discontent within Russia? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for both the United States and Iran to start ringing alarm bells to the Russians, and then the Russians just don't, according to them at least, it's just an attempt to destabilize the country. That's what Putin said publicly. It indicates a lack of treating the situation seriously. I want to read more of this. The members of ISIS-K, were instructed to prepare for significant operation in Russia. One of the terrorists arrested in Iran said some members of the group had already traveled to Russia. A third source, a senior security official, said, as Iran has been a victim of terror attacks for years, Iranian authorities fulfilled their obligation to alert Moscow based on information acquired from those arrested terrorists. Here's a response from Kremlin spokesperson, this is Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. I do not know anything about this. The United States and Iran were ringing alarm bells about a terror attack, with the United States even telling the Russians, hey, it could be a concert hall. It's going to be in Moscow. With the Iranians and the Americans getting this information from two separate ways. We get it through interception of communication. They get it through interrogating suspects. It'd be one thing if it was just one slight sign of a possible terror attack. But when those signals are getting sent by intercepted communications from captured real terrorists that were involved in bombing and killing real people. I don't know if you guys remember, but a few months before this attack in Russia, there was a big bombing in Iran that, due to the conflict between Israel and Hamas, that many people suspected it was Israel. I think a lot of people jumped to conclusions because they didn't know the history of ISIS and ISIS terrorism in Iran. ISIS then came out and claimed it. And a lot of people got egg on their face over saying, oh, we know for sure it was the Israelis. Most of those con artists had moved on immediately, forgot they even said it or didn't even want to address it. But this is the same thing happening again here, where a bunch of people jump to conclusions, and in this instance, and end up supplementing the Russian government and them trying to push their agenda, their propaganda, when this should be a massive, massive political scandal for the Russians. Every time there's an update to this, the story gets worse. There was a massive terror attack. Horrible. The Russians were extremely slow in their response to the terror attack. Horrible. 144 people died due to, in large part, that slow response. Horrible. They were given a warning in advance. Horrible. They were told the city was going to happen in. Horrible. They were told the type of venue it could happen in a concert hall. Horrible. They were warned by multiple countries, countries both geopolitically opposed to them and countries both geopolitically aligned to them. Horrible. Two countries got those two pieces of information through different avenues. Meaning you don't got one piece of evidence gathered by multiple people, but multiple different pieces of evidence from multiple different sources pointing towards the same conclusion. And what do the Russians say 3 days before the attack? Well, let me be more specific. What does Vladimir Putin say 3 days before the attack? This is all an attempt to cause discontent and instability within Russia. The evidence is overwhelming for who carried out the attack. That is, to me, we've been spending so much time in the arena of who carried out the attack, even though the evidence at this point is overwhelmingly clear who carried out the attack. It's all pointing in one direction, and despite the Russians' bold claims to the contrary, they've been unable to provide any physical evidence, really any evidence, period, outside of circumstantial. I was reading Russian state newspapers. Let me be better. I was listening to Steve Rosenberg read Russian state newspapers and listening to I heard Obama had a meeting 3 days before the terror attack. Just this random grabbing of just whatever they can get. Circumstantial evidence, no evidence, random theorizing, just complete nonsense, hogwash, horse hockey. Because they got nothing. But because we're stuck in this debate, we're not talking about the bigger question, which is the question that Netanyahu is facing in Israel right now. How did the security candidate, how did the security government, how did the stability government of Vladimir Putin, who came into power saying he was going to combat and crush Islamic terrorism? People forget this, but it was in the midst of the Chechen wars that Vladimir Putin rose to prominence, saying he was going to crush the suspects. He was going to crush the forces behind the apartment bombings. And now here we are decades later, and we're here. And they can't even address the problem directly because it doesn't serve the interests of conquesting Ukraine. And remember what I've said multiple times during this about security crises and how the Russian state cannot deal with multiple security crises right now. This is not, I think, the example of what I was talking about. I was more talking about more rebellion or large scale uprising or large scale protests. But this is another security crisis. And if the FSB is concentrated on locking up Ukrainian kids, tying yellow ribbons to trees in Mariupol, then they're not busy busting terrorists that are trying to plan terror attacks in Ukrainian and Russian urban centers. This should be a massive political scandal in any country that has a semi-healthy, just one functioning lung in their political system. But thankfully for Putin, that is not the Russian political system as of late.